So welcome everybody to this special plenary session. It was organized late, but obviously after the election, we felt that we should, the AHA felt that there should be a panel discussing the 2016 election, and we're delighted to see people coming to this. We know people maybe had to leave dinner early, but we're grateful for everybody showing up. Because we just have an hour, we're not going to do have presentations here. So my name is David Bell. I teach French history at Princeton, so I'm not an expert in American history, but I am on the research division of the AHA. So I'll be chairing the session, but mostly what I'll just be doing is introducing our panelists, and then starting off by asking a few questions of them about the election. And then after we've done that, we'll just throw the floor open and have a discussion. And we have a microphone here. So once we go to the general discussion, please just line up behind the microphone and feel free to pose questions either to one or to all of the panelists. So again, thank you very much for coming. And let me just quickly introduce our panelists. I'm just going to do this in alphabetical order. So here to my left is David Greenberg. He's professor of history and media studies at Rutgers University. He's the author of many books, including Nixon's Shadow, The History of an Image, and most recently, Republic of Spin, a backstage history of American politics, which won the Orwell Award of the National Council of Teachers of English. Then to my right is Vicki Ruiz, who's Distinguished Professor of History and of Chicano Latino Studies at the University of California, Irvine. She is former president of the AHA. She's also a recipient of the National Humanities Medal. She's the author also of many books, including Cannery Women, Cannery Lives, Mexican Women Unionization and the California Food Industry, and also From Out of the Shadows, Mexican Women in 20th Century America, and of much else. Then our third, I won't say our third speaker because, as I said, we're just going to be having a more informal discussion, but the third person I'm introducing is Tyler Stovall, who is Distinguished Professor of History and Dean of Humanities at the University of California at Santa Cruz, and he is also the current president of the AHA. He too is the author of many, many books, including The Rise of the Paris Red Belt, Paris Noir, African Americans in the City of Light, and Paris in the Spirit of 1919, Consumer Struggles, Transnationalism, and Revolution. And last but not least, we have Leah Wright-Rigueur, who is an assistant professor of public policy at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard. She writes regularly on American politics for a wide variety of publications, and her first book appeared in 2015, and it was entitled The Loneliness of the Black Republican, Pragmatic Politics and the Pursuit of Power. So welcome to all the panelists, and many thanks to the panelists for doing this panel at pretty much at the last minute. So as I said, I'm going to throw out a few questions and then simply open it up to the floor. So as the first question, and this is not just for David, but I do note that David is the editor of a book series entitled Pivotal Moments in American History. So raises the question, will there be a book someday in this series about the election of 2016? And if so, what will it say? If the election was a pivotal moment, what were the crucial factors that made it a pivotal moment? So maybe you could each take a moment to sort of think out loud about this question.
Sure. Well, since you mentioned me, I'll start with a few thoughts, and there's, I could probably tick off more reasons for 2016 being pivotal than I'll go into now, and others can offer additional ones. The first thing, it seems to me that by mid-2016, it became clear that it was a pivotal moment for the Republican Party. And right now, in the wake of the Democrats' loss, there's lots of hand-wringing about the future of the Democrats, but it seems clear to me that it's absolutely the Republican Party that went through the greater shock, and after 40 years, really since Richard Nixon, of having a fairly coherent, consistent governing philosophy, along comes a candidate who really defies Republican orthodoxy on a number of really fundamental issues, from taxes to trade to foreign policy, and is not only not punished as all the pundits expect, but is rewarded for that. And so there was a discrediting of the Republican establishment that extended to a fairly coherent Republican conservative ideology that had seemed pretty indomitable for a long time. Then the other way, which is at least just important, I think that 2016 was pivotal, is I think it showed the real fragility of our democracy and the weakness of a whole range of norms and institutions that many of us, if not all of us, had long expected to be sort of the bulwark against demagoguery and fascism and other things that may be upon us. And Trump's ability to sort of flout all of these norms, from not releasing his taxes to just the sheer kind of bullying and insulting and vituperation of his rivals on stage with him, to to the casual mendacity with which he kind of barreled his way through the race, I think has given many of us a shock that we expected these behaviors to be punished, to eliminate him, to disqualify him. And of course, that didn't happen. So those I would start with as two of the fundamental ways that this has really changed our politics, or at least made us think in new ways about the state of American democracy and politics.
Who would like to go next?
I will.
Vicki.
Well, I see it as a pivotal moment in terms of a resurgence of nativism, the trope that keeps on hating. The parallels. I knew what I felt that the upswing of nativism was when you had the unaccompanied child migrants from Central America, and you had all of those sort of homemaker types out protesting, trying to stop the buses from going into to a small town in Arizona. And they were using that these are disease. They were bringing diseases. And so I immediately thought of Alan Kraut in Silent Travelers. And I said, next time I teach an immigration class, I'm going to use some of this footage. I'm going to show the clip, and they're going to read a chapter as a way to show the continuity. I mean, what our president-elect has said and his surrogates is really nothing new. It's like he, read Kenneth Roberts's articles in the Saturday Evening Post in the 1920s. It's like he's reading European American settlers in Texas in the 1830s or New Mexico. These are the same sort of images.
Yeah, so first, thank you for having me here and for having me be a part of this panel. I would absolutely say that 2016 is a pivotal moment because everything changes. Now, I think we can all sit in this room and we can talk about historical precedents, and we can see, lots of different examples. We can, pull things out of the historical record. The difference is that all of those what-if moments are actually real right now. And I think that's something that we actually have to grapple with. We also have to talk about the fractures or the fragility of these coalitions. I think many of us saw that these were, these political coalitions within both political parties, within the two-party system, were ones that were in some cases weak. In other cases, they were delicate, they were fragile. And right now what we're talking about is what happens when those things disintegrate. The other side of the coin, I think, is that the election has given kind of a false sense of strength, at least within the Republican Party. And what I think what we need to be doing is pushing back on that and really thinking again about what polarization means for 2016. What does it meant historically? But also, what do those fractures within coalitions, then the disparate kind of connections within the Republican Party mean for a party that is united under Donald Trump, so moving forward. So thinking about what are the implications of that, what is that rooted in, where is it going to go? And I also just want to just make sure that we address this idea of, I think, seeing what happens when we don't necessarily pay attention to non-voters. So the issue of non-voters as an electoral issue has been a long-standing problem. And in fact, we can look back at previous presidential elections in moments where kind of liberalism, as traditional liberalism, hasn't necessarily resulted in the election results that maybe many of us in this room wanted. And one of the things that goes into that is non-voters and their reasons for not voting, whether it be a protest vote, maybe it's disillusionment, maybe it's alienation. But those are one of those things I think when we think about 2016 and this particular moment as a pivotal moment, it's about all of the what ifs becoming real.
Okay. Well, I'm going to partly respond as a sort of typical historian by citing the great Chinese communist leader Zhou Enlai, who, when asked what were the ultimate lessons of the French Revolution, responded, "It's too early to tell." And this was a century and a half after the revolution. Partly it is early to tell, but I think one can discern certain basic phenomena. And these are not just American, but I think they're also global. What you see, especially in America and also in Europe, is really the decline, almost the abandonment of the center-left in Western politics. And this is a political group that really rose to prominence after the Second World War with the rise and creation of the welfare state, but it has not been able to maintain its integrity in the face of globalization, in the face of a sort of neo-capitalist resurgence in the late 20th, early 21st century. And so you see this not just in the United States, but of course in Britain, in France, where the left is pretty much all but extinct, as far as my colleagues like to say, and in many other countries as well. And there is an anger out there about the failure of the center-left to deliver a sort of decent lifestyle, to protect the lifestyles of many working people against the new capitalist world order, that this election has really made salient. And the fact is, it has also taken the form, as Vicki Ruiz said, of nativism. We saw that clearly with Brexit, for example. We've seen that in France, we were seeing that in Germany, and we certainly saw that in the United States. So what you have, I think, is a very interesting combination that is not at all unusual in American history, but is especially important now, of both working class populist protest and racist protest at the same time.
Well, actually, I think what I'd like to do is maybe just continue with this theme just a little bit more, and to come to precisely to what you said there, Tyler, because if you think about it, so clearly one of the factors that motivated the Trump voters was a fear of sort of the free movement of people, of ideas, of goods across borders. Sort of a fear of the external in general, and of this kind of flow that you don't have clear boundaries, a wall. I mean, there's no. It's clear that the rhetoric that Trump had of "let's build a wall" resonated very, very strongly with a lot of people. And as you just said, part of this is, a reaction against, globalization, against what has been called neoliberalism, but it also manifests as nativism. It poses the problem: how do you actually manage to draw a distinction there to, in order to protect people, but at the same time to get them to understand that the poor immigrants or the refugees who are coming into the United States may not actually be, the same phenomenon as the movement of jobs, because for somebody like Trump, it's very clear that he's trying to present this as very much the same phenomenon. It's a phenomenon of movement, of globalization. He's against all of it. He wants a strong nation state. So maybe, if people want to discuss this a little bit. Anyone want to take a crack at that?
Well, I'll start, and I mean, I don't think that Trump is necessarily wrong. I mean, there clearly is a connection between flows of goods in the form of free trade and flows of populations, and there is an ideological coherence, I think, between anti-trade and anti-immigration positions, and it is fracture, fight that we've seen in both parties, where the extremist wings of both parties are both more nativist and more anti-trade. I mean, don't forget, Bernie Sanders began the 2016 election as an immigration opponent, and he moderated on that when he saw it was not a popular stance in the Democratic Party. And there were other candidates in my state of New York. Zephyr Teachout, sort of popular insurgent candidate, was sort of indistinguishable from Donald Trump in a lot of her rhetoric about trade, and yet was sort of hailed by progressives. So there are, I think, real ideological camps about nationalists versus internationalists, accepting globalization and maybe trying to make peace with it and find the policies to redress its ills versus trying to stop it and turn back the clock. And I think those fissures are real and are going to play out in both parties for some time to come.
Well, I think that immigration has been sort of caught up within the spiral of fake news. You had during the presidential campaign the images of Mexicanos, flooding the border. Terms like invasion was used, but actually, the Pew Research study showed that actually for the last few years, Mexican net migration has been pretty much at zero. And there is this tangible, the human impact, I think, that we have to see in terms of we have 750,000 individuals who qualify for DACA, which is deferred action for childhood arrivals. For children, people who were brought as children before, who could not be born, but after 1981. And I mean, not before. They could not be born before 1981. Sorry, they could not be born. And it's for young people, and it's for students who are continuing in college, and it's also for military service. And there's a real cost. What's going to happen? Will they have their work authorizations? Will their Social Security numbers be taken from them? Driver's license. And there's a real fear. There's a real human cost here. And it's for those of us who teach, there is a real, we have students in our classes who, this affects them. It affects their families. It is just not DACA students. We have 16 million people who, in this country, who live in mixed status families, where the children may be citizenship, or citizens, or their parents are not, their grandparents. And looking at the ways in which how can we help these students? How can we support these students? What are the policies in place? Is there a coordinator? Is there a legal clinic? And I think this is some of the important answers. I mean, I've been very proud of my own institution, the University of California, Irvine. We have a statement of sort of best practices for deans and also for faculty. Our UCI School of Law has an immigrant rights clinic. We have a Dreamers coordinator. We have the second largest population of DACA students in the UC system, approximately over 600 students. 29% actually are not Latino. They're Asian. And I think it's important that we also talk about not only sort of the globalization, neoliberalism, trade, people, but also look about how this is going to impact our students.
Any comments to that?
Okay, just a few comments. I mean, I think that, Vicki's points are really well taken, because this is not just about grand historical flows, it's about individuals and communities as well. And I think one of the things that's really fascinating in all of this is that Trump was very successful in helping to develop a narrative that immigration is actually one of the reasons for white working class stagnation, for the stagnation of red states. There's no evidence that I know of that supports that contention. Of course, lack of evidence never really stopped Donald Trump. But it is an interesting issue nonetheless. For example, I recently read an editorial, an op-ed piece that talked about the belief that one of the reasons why there is a lack of jobs in the United States is the omnipresence of liberal regulation and liberal economic policies. Well, I come from a state, California, that is full of liberal regulation. It also has an incredibly dynamic economy. In the month of September, for example, out of every 100 new jobs in the United States created, 42 were created in California. So it's a narrative that has no legs, but I mean, it has no rational legs, and yet it clearly does have legs because it clearly motivated people to vote to support Donald Trump.
All right, and the same goes for trade. I mean, the notion that NAFTA is sort of responsible for deindustrialization, I mean, all of us know it started long before, right? This is a problem people were talking about in the 70s and 80s, and yet it's, trade and immigration both were sort of the great scapegoats that Trump effectively mobilized.
So can I just say one thing? So I also think in the discussion that it might be worth having maybe even talking a little bit about how we're in a moment where and I think we've been in moments like this before, where it's not enough to be right. It's not enough to have evidence. It's not enough to deal with fact. And so that's something that we, particularly as historians who are rooted in evidence, archives, fact, right, and logic, really have to wrestle with. So I'm intrigued by this idea, or bothered, I don't know what you want to call it, but this idea of, one of the things that Donald Trump was able to do effectively was pick up on this idea that has long roots and has long history, right? So Donald Trump doesn't come in and invent the fact that, if I toss out conspiracy theories, people will eat it up. But I think there's some unpacking that we have to do behind that. And then we also have to really come to terms with, or at least figure out ways to think about, how do we deal with an audience or a public or an American, body politic where fact and evidence just simply don't hold the same weight that they may have, 30 years ago?
I think I'll ask one last question here, a very quick question. Directly following from what Leah just said, is it in fact been the case always in American history that that fact and truth prevailed and that people paid attention, or have we often been in what one of my panelists here calls a republic of spin? And it goes to the question of, but it goes to, I think, a really fundamental question about 2016, which is, living in this moment, and for many of us certainly not agreeing politically with the incoming administration, feeling, really quite despairing about the prospect. But to what extent is this really a completely new sort of moment in American history? To what extent have we seen things like this before? And with that, I'll stop, and after we've had the panelists respond to this, then we'll open up the floor to other questions. Vicki.
Your comments, I immediately thought of Audre Lorde, actually, with this comments and using the master's tools in terms of how do we craft a narrative? How do we craft our words? How do we gain the attention? I was talking to a colleague earlier today who said that 1/3 of the students, undergraduates in her class, had voted for Trump, even though the majority had supported Barack Obama. And they asked, well, then why did you vote for Donald Trump? And they said, because he's a celebrity. They know him. That they've watched the shows. They followed him, and he speaks. He says what he means, and she says, well, do you know all of this scripted? It's all scripted, and then try to show the ways in which the narratives get spun. And for her, it was that struck home was the power of social media, and the power of the media, and what has happened, and what are ways in which we can. Through organizations, through working together in coalitions, but also the way in which we get our message out.
Let me just point out that Vicki and I come from the state that elected Arnold Schwarzenegger. So this is not the first time we've had somebody, and people said at the time literally that they voted for him because they liked his movies.
Yeah.
So this is not the first time we've seen this kind of celebrity status translating into political success.
Yeah, I mean, to go back to your question, David, I think part of what is underlying it is the notion, which I think is undeniably true, that the intense polarization we've seen for the last couple of decades, really, I think the Clinton impeachment is kind of one of the key moments in this, and then the Bush v. Gore recount fight, and then the state of Congress for so long, points to something that social media has also intensified. Different camps seeing and perceiving reality in fundamentally different ways. And I think it's easy to imagine that this is new, because within most of our memories, we can point to points of at least temporary consensus in our politics. Even though there's always been political conflict, there have been moments, as recently maybe as 9/11, when some kind of consensus prevailed. And yet, the more we think about it, clearly there have been other moments in our history where different groups of Americans saw political reality in fundamentally different ways. I mean, the Civil War and the years before the Civil War being the most obvious and extreme example. But we can even point to the years preceding World War II and the way the isolationists saw the world conflict, so different from Franklin Roosevelt's view. So I do think there have been other moments, obviously not quite in this configuration with social media. In my book, in Republic of Spin, which you nicely mentioned, I take up the line that we hear a lot of people say these days. It's often attributed to Moynihan, but I found actually goes back to Bernard Baruch. Everyone is entitled to his own opinions, but not to his own facts. And, we all kind of like this line and the sentiment. I think the problem with it, and of course I agree with it, but the problem with it is that political disagreement is really about which facts we weight and to which facts we give priority, which count the most, which can be discounted. Now, of course, we do have this question of fake news, invented facts, right, disinformation closet, but a lot of these differences, think about Trump and the Clinton campaign's bet, a bad one it turned out, but one that most of us, I think, wouldn't have second-guessed at the time, that reminding people of so much of Trump's racism, misogyny, his making fun of Serge Kovaleski, a disabled reporter, his dismissive remarks about all kinds of groups, that those were real facts. But Trump voters, it's not that they denied those facts, they just didn't think they mattered that much. They thought Hillary's email server mattered more. They thought a change from the Clinton years mattered more. They thought other things mattered more. So, without denying that there are differences in how we perceive reality, a lot of it gets to these just fundamental questions of how we weight and prioritize and sort of consider the significance of different aspects of our reality.
So I'll say quickly, because I can't wait till we get to the Q&A. I think that we can all, again, see historical precedents, that there are several people that we can point to, both in the immediate American history. We can go even farther back, although I see Sean Wilens, and I know on Thursday you said, don't you dare compare it to Andrew Jackson. But so I think there are several moments, and actually quite a few moments, where we can say this is very much rooted in this. We can look at Reagan, for example, and we can look at several moments in Reagan's 1980 campaign and draw, comparisons between what Trump did and, in a much cruder version or something like that. But actually, I think what is perhaps a little bit more useful is thinking about the ways in which these precedents create foundations for what ultimately builds to Donald Trump, and not necessarily just on the Republican side of things, but also on the Democratic side of things, right? So how very specific decisions, how shifts in directions, how decision making around certain changes actually leads to a moment that allows Donald Trump to enter into the arena of politics through the Republican Party, really knock out 17 other contenders, and at the end of the day, beat Hillary Clinton to become president-elect of the United States. That's something that we need to do, some digging and figuring out about. The only other thing that I'll point out is that there are some areas, though, where we really are in uncharted territory. There are certain political norms that even amongst the wildest of characters just have held fast, that are rapidly eroding, in the last couple of months since we've actually had the election, right? Not to mention the campaign. There are the shifting of political rules that have implications, right? So part of, I think, what we're looking at now is what happens when we end up in a moment that is actually history, right? Where history is happening, where things are changing, where we don't actually know what the outcome is going to be. Part of that is being, pulling back and saying we won't know what the implications of this are for a very long time. But actually, I think understanding that this is something that, even as it's part of a trend, is also something wildly different from what most people in this room have written about, have read about, or have ever experienced in their lifetime.
Okay, well, I think we should now move to the Q&A. Because we have such a cavernous room, not quite as bad as the convention center, which seems to be, built for Gulliver's Land of Giants, but this is still pretty bad. So I would ask people please to step up to the microphone, and I would please ask you to be concise. 2 or 3 sentences is fine. Please do not give a lecture, because we have a lot of people who I'm sure are going to want to ask questions. So thank you, please.
Yeah, thank you. My name is David Lohner. I'm a student at the University of Cambridge. What lessons can we take from the failure of states like my home state, North Carolina, to include young people in its political apparatus? Is there a way that we can look to the past to see examples of how liberal coalitions were able to marshal young people to take on challenges that the right produced, like Donald Trump?
Great, thank you.
I'm thinking of the United Farm Workers and Cesar Chavez. They would have never have gotten union contracts if they had not mobilized students, not just in California, but across the country, and the way in which that was the national and international boycott, in which that of table grapes that began this process. But it was single focused, so it wasn't as sort of a global issue, but it was one in which you had students come from across the country to go and volunteer for a summer, or to be a picket captain at Safeway, as a way in which to show support and the idea that change could be possible. And it was this, as I said, that was in part through their work as boycott coordinators, going with $5 a day and a bag of buttons to a place they'd never been before, and begin to organize.
And maybe I'm seeing not a fully representative slice of young people today, but I'm not sure I agree with the implied premise of the question. It seems to me college students and other young people today are as active and mobilized and politically animated as they have been in quite a long time, perhaps since the 60s. And I saw on my campus and otherwise in my experience, there are a lot of enthusiasm and sometimes frustration with the candidates or with particular political positions, but certainly not a lack of involvement or passion. So I'm not sure that young people's apathy, that in the 80s and that seemed like an important problem. I don't think that's the key problem today.
So, I think it might be actually useful to kind of parse out a little bit of this question, right? So if we look at, say, data from the Black Youth Project, which measures Black, White, Latino, Asian, and Latino, everyone, young people, they actually find that young people today are actually more politically engaged, right? They're not engaged with the two-party American political system. And in fact, that has been on the decline since 2008, where they hit this peak, right, of engagement. So there are a number of reasons for that, right? So a lot of them, they were engaged, they were organizing and mobilizing around Barack Obama. So one of the things we might look at is how Obama for America, and later Organizing for America, actually failed to translate that youth enthusiasm around Barack Obama into the larger Democratic Party, right? And so into institutional politics. The other thing is that traditional methods that have worked to integrate young people into, say, traditional electoral politics just aren't there. So if we look at Black youth, for example, their engagement with the church, right? Black people have the highest religiosity of any race in the United States, but young Black people are actually disengaging from the church because they are skeptical of the church as a site of mobilization, right? So we're actually not seeing the same thing. There is a transformation that is happening, and to be honest, in the 2015, 2016, there wasn't a real recognition of the problem as a long-term trend, right? So there was this assumption that what happened in 2008, what happened in 2012 would remain true in 2016, even though the trend was suggesting, right, that Barack Obama was an outlier and that numbers were more likely to look like 2000 or 2004. So the real question is, how do you get people engaged and to change that mobilization into electoral politics, which is something that young people are highly skeptical of? I think one, just to give you one solution perhaps, is to look at something like Reverend Barber's Moral Mondays in North Carolina, which has actually been incredibly successful at mobilizing young people in the last 2 months alone. So one might say, I think one of the other ways to get people involved, young people involved, which is actually what people on the ground are doing, is something like Black Lives Matter, which is actually organizing across the country in state and local legislatures and really contemplating moving into those arenas. So that may be a site moving forward for something like that.
I'll just toss in my 2 cents here, which is simply, since this is a fairly general question, that to mobilize anybody, you either need an attractive cause or an attractive person to mobilize behind. I think one of the basic problems in the 2016 election was a Democratic candidate who did not manage to excite these people personally, and who did not articulate specific policies behind which and specific goals for which people could organize as well. I don't think. So in that sense, I think a great deal of this may have been contingent. But let's go to the next question, please.
I guess I don't want to discount the issue of the human costs and specificities, but of the impact on individuals' lives. But I guess I also want to think about the opportunities that 2015 and 2016 revealed. It seemed to me that it was the greatest public education in the nature and limitation of our parties that in my lifetime. What is a political party? Who elects their officers? How do they run? The limitations of the Democratic Party. On the one hand, we heard a generation of leftists foursquare behind the Democratic Party prior to the election, but after the election saying things about maybe there's a way future beyond, a way forward apart from the Democratic Party. Is it, the sorts of things that we haven't heard in party politics since the 1960s. And I'm wondering about two things. One is, I think, the increasing incapacity of historians to think about political history, in terms of its actual organization, its parties, the sorts of things that an earlier generation wrote about. My generation of historians is not good about writing, not good in writing about it, and hasn't produced that work. And I think that there's going to be a panel tomorrow about the crisis of political history and political thinking. I think that that's interesting. But given that, I wonder, and this I think gets to the issue of the non-voter, right? I think that the issue of the non-voter and the failure of our party politics to mediate society. What historical precedents are there for this scale? I know it would be different in the past, but this scale of the crisis of the party political system in the United States.
Thank you.
Well, I think, in the course of the 20th century, there's been a sort of long-term decline of the parties. And what's interesting now is we actually have almost 19th century level of intensity of partisanship without the institutional support of the parties. And I think party leaders, elected officials, I would say in both parties, I mean, my personal politics make me more concerned with the Democrats, really have a duty to strengthen the parties and to sort of cast a skeptical eye on the ideas being floated about getting rid of super delegates or opening up primaries to independents, reforms that would further weaken the parties as institutions, and that counterintuitive for some people, but we need strong parties. The Democratic Party, in my view, is the greatest single instrument of social reform of the 20th century. If you had conservative politics, you might say that of the Republican Party, I suppose, but that the parties are vital to our system, and so we need to find ways to sort of shore up in a time of an assault on authority, an assault on institutions, to make these institutions stronger, to sort of fend off the extremism that we've seen in 2016.
Because what I'm thinking about is, right after the election, I went and I reread Richard Hofstadter's The Paranoid Style in American Politics, because it actually gave me hope. Because I said, okay, I understand how he's writing this and why. And, we went on to another era, and so things didn't fall apart with McCarthyism. And I thought, okay, this is part of it. And I thought that to me was, okay, this has happened, this is not new, that it is a part of, the paranoid style is a part of U.S. political history. And to me, that helped.
I'm going to perhaps argue something a bit different. First of all, let me take your point about political history and the decline of what I think you're calling sort of institutional political history. There definitely has been a decline. It's also true that historians have looked at politics in other kinds of ways. I mean, many cultural historians foreground political culture and look at the ways in which politics inform many different aspects of life, not just party structures. Let me also offer a personal anecdote. My parents were able to send me to college, to a private college, and my sister to a private college at the same time, and we're 10 months apart. So for 3 years, they were paying double tuition. We did not receive financial aid, and my parents were by no means wealthy. But when I was in my teens, my parents could afford to do that on a middle-class salary. The fact that nobody can even think of doing something like that today underscores a major problem.
Yes.
And it seems to be a problem that neither party really has an answer for. And I think that was one of the reasons why, for example, it was very hard to argue to people that if you voted for Hillary Clinton, she would answer that kind of problem.
I would just like to interject one note here, which is that it seems to me that Donald Trump shows that in a sense, that you don't need to rely on the party in the way that people used to, and that there is a thing out there, which is a kind of conservative machine, which includes talk radio, Fox News, a large part of the Congressional Republican Party, large numbers of Tea Party organizations. This is not a party in any traditional sense. It does not have a top-down leadership. It does not have coordination, and yet there is very definitely a line or a series of lines, closely related, lines, as we used to say about the Communist Party. There's the line, and it enforces it brutally. And as Trump shows, if you can actually make use of it, you can win an election certainly without the traditional party apparatus. So I think we may be moving into an area into an era where we have, something that goes beyond traditional political parties, at least on the right in American politics.
Or can I just, one little thing, I think. I do think it is important that Donald Trump used the apparatus of the Republican Party in order to become president of the United States. So I think this is one of the, and Theta Scopel has a really interesting article in Vox that in part talks about this, at least within the framework of the Democratic Party, how the Democratic Party can use the history of the Republican Party in order to make advances. But he uses kind of these apparati and these, these shifts and the kind of this idea of winning and power and loyalty that has traditionally been incredibly important to Republicans in order to advance step after step after step. So there's a reason why over the summer, when he says, all kinds of crazy and racist things, that Paul Ryan, gets up in front and is doing press conferences about how we're the party of Lincoln. They're not, but is doing all of these things. And when asked, so does this mean that you're not going to endorse Donald Trump? He goes, no such thing. I still plan on voting for Donald Trump. So there's something there, I think, about this idea of loyalty, of power, of winning that is incredibly important, perhaps even more so than an ideology that unites Republicans together. And it's something that, looking at the Democratic Party, I do think that there are actually political histories that are trying to wrestle with that, right? So Lily Geismer's book, Don't Blame Us, is actually looking at this idea of the Democratic Party, of institutions of power, and of working class whites and ethnics in Massachusetts. So there is, I think, some attention to this, but there is a real opportunity to take political history in a direction that looks at things like the nuts and bolts and combines it with the really innovative things that, other areas of political history have been doing and should continue to be doing.
All right, next question, please. Sorry to keep you waiting.
Hi, hi Vicki. My name's Andrea. I'm an ABD at UC Irvine. And have been very involved in campus activism both before and after the election of 2016. I would like to hear you all reflect, especially given that we have so many distinguished members of the AHA on the board, about how, given this moment of bizarre continuities and seismic change, we might take this as an opportunity to reevaluate how we do graduate education. Specifically, I feel very strongly myself that digital history, public history, and pedagogy are essential to crafting a generation of historians that can contend politically with this moment. And I know that I'm not the only person here who's invested in creating change, not merely noting it and analyzing it. And so I'm curious to hear what ideas you all might have for making the next generation of historians more capable of writing the narrative instead of having to have panels like this where we talk about how the narrative has changed and we were left out of the conversation. Thank you.
Well, let me respond in a couple of venues, and I think Vicki can take this up as well. We do have a number of programs that do address graduate education, such as the Next Generation program, which is looking for ways of making available to history graduate students careers in outside academia, for example. And these programs are both responding to a real crisis. Well, it's not a crisis because it hasn't been short term, the lack of academic opportunities, and also, trying to argue that in a nation where increasingly people are saying that people with skills and research skills are in short supply, this is how we can help contribute to the future of the United States. So there are those kinds of programs that we have. Now, the political impact of those, we shall see. I mean, and it makes me wonder, would we have had the same conversation in 2008 or 2012 about graduate education, even though so many of these programs, so many of these problems were existing then? Or would we be having that conversation now had something like 100,000 votes shifted in Michigan and Wisconsin and Pennsylvania?
Yeah, I mean, I know this isn't exactly what you were saying, but I don't think that Trump's election is attributable to the failure of graduate history education. Now, again, I'm joking here, but I think Tyler's last remark, there clearly are often, and I think especially since the 2008 crash, but really predating that by several decades, questions about graduate employment and so on that should very much concern us. But I don't think they map in any neat or clear way onto a particular political outcome of one election. I think, in fact, sometimes it's important to keep these issues separate and to not treat the problem of graduate education as getting election outcomes we like, but as a problem legitimate unto itself.
For me, well, of course, we have the AHA Career Diversity Project, and one of the key questions that we're going to be, in terms of the application asked for, is what is the mission of your graduate program? I think that will be, for those institutions who apply for these grants, I think that there's not an easy answer. I think that departments are still grappling with what is the purpose. We have the idea of, well, yes, and there are all these different opportunities, and there are, but it's in isolation. And I think the AHA Career Diversity Project has a lot of potential in terms of exploring the career tracks in public history, in the corporate world, tech world, the way in which, and also I think it's important in terms of looking at K through 12 education. Many young people growing up today, their last history course is in 11th or 12th grade. What are the ways in which we can translate our scholarship, calibrate it for a K through 12 audience?
All right, we are coming close to the end here. We have two
Yes.
people remaining, and I think we'll take their questions, and then we'll wrap up after that. So the first question, please.
My name is Dave Ford. I'm with the St. Joseph Preparatory School in Philadelphia, so there's K through 12. My question is about trade. In the wake of the election, I was working with my students on some of the issues. One of them came up with regards to the attitudes towards free trade agreements. I showed my students a 1999 poll, a Pew poll, where the majority of Republicans had a positive view of free trade and a majority of Democrats had a negative view. Yet in a recent 2016 poll, it was exactly the opposite. Majority of Democrats had a positive view of free trade agreements. Majority of Republicans had a negative view. And then if you look at the AFL-CIO's page, free trade agreements are one of the great evils of our society, one of the major Democratic constituencies. So what happened amongst Democratic identified voters to switch their views on free trade, and the same with the Republicans, despite the labor unions' disagreement with free trade agreements?
Well, there's been research recently that sort of reaffirms, I think, what a number of scholars have supposed for a while, which is that party positions tend to follow the positions of the political leaders, and that much as we, in this room, many of the people who participate in the political discourse are well informed and have their well-formed opinion. For many people, they take their cues from their political leaders, and the fact that the Democratic political leadership, the presidents, the candidates, have been by and large free traders since Bill Clinton, as they had historically been, for many decades, is much more of a cue and a signal setter than the positions of the AFL-CIO, like it or not. By the same token, Donald Trump's ascendancy to the head of the Republican Party has caused a rapid shift in how a lot of rank-and-file Republicans regard trade, as well as how they regard Vladimir Putin and how they regard Julian Assange and all kinds of other things where a few years ago or a few weeks ago, they held some very different positions. So there is this phenomenon, Larry Bartels and others have written about this recently, where, as much as we don't like to admit this, opinions follow where the party leaders go often rather than the other way around.
All right, Sean Mullins.
Just thinking about political history for a sec, one aspect of the election that you haven't talked about was how tainted it was. And I was curious about that. I mean, look, we've had nasty, 1824, 1876, 2000. Never have we seen a foreign power interfere with our election as it happened. Never has a director of the FBI suppressed that information and brought up frivolous information at the very end of a campaign. The voter suppression in North Carolina and in Wisconsin was extraordinary. That's less well known, but there it is. So this has an aspect of being tainted beyond any election, certainly that I can think of in American history. Where does that leave us? I mean, I don't know what's going to happen. Currently, we don't know. But let's suppose it just kind of goes on. Has democracy been degraded, in other words, in this election in a way that we may not be able to recover from?
A republic if you can keep it.
Well, I'll respond in a couple of respects because I think you're absolutely right. But I think this election has also revealed the way in which the political structure of this country is so tilted. I mean, for example, I was telling some students of mine, if you're looking at the distribution of population, Los Angeles County has more inhabitants than 40 of the 50 American states because it has 10 million people. And yet if you want to move to a place where your vote will count less than probably anywhere else, it's probably LA. Mm-hmm. Okay? So you have a situation where the tilt towards rural areas has become perhaps more manifest than it has been in a long time in this country. But the other thing I wanted to emphasize is that part of the problem that the Democratic Party has had is that it has focused so much on the presidency. But you look at other levels of politics, the Republicans now control 3/4 of the governorships in the country. They control 3/4 of the state legislatures in the country. And this was not something that happened this year. In some ways, it really, well, it's gone on for a while, but 2010 maybe was perhaps more significant as a date than 2016. So I think you're right, but that's only part of the problem, unfortunately.
I mean, I would just add that I think your critique and concern, particularly on Comey, but even more so about the Russian hacking of the election, is entirely well-founded. And what is especially eerie is to look back and actually see these alarms having been raised during the campaign, including by Hillary Clinton, quite explicitly in the third debate, and yet somehow or other it didn't, ever quite get the traction and the attention that it warranted, and it was always, something else, the latest Trump outrage about some offensive thing he said that, grabbed the media attention even more. I think going forward, I am certainly not a Pollyanna. I'm typically fairly optimistic about our democratic politics, and I haven't been able to find that optimism at all since November 9th. But I do think about, as one who's written on Nixon, the fact that Nixon in 1972 won a 49-state landslide, despite there being a fair degree of knowledge about Watergate out there in the public domain, and yet people told pollsters they didn't know the first thing about Watergate. By April of 1973, just a few months into the second term, Haldeman, Ehrlichman, Dean are all resigning, that it's, the fire has started in the White House. None of which is to say I expect. In fact, I think there's probably a very small chance that Donald Trump would be impeached. I think there's a much greater chance that he'll serve 2 terms. But it seems to me at least plausible that if an investigation shows that there was not only the Russian hacking, but active collusion between Trump or his campaign and Putin, which strikes me as a possibility, purely speculative. I'm not saying it is the case. I honestly, have no way of knowing, but it seems to me it's plausible. If there is evidence of the effect, and you had a few honest Republicans of Lindsey Graham, John McCain turn on Trump in this regard? It seems to me plausible that just as with Watergate, it was a crisis of democracy, and people asked the questions you've asked about, will democracy recover? And by and large, we felt it did. That there is a vision I can imagine where we recover. But there's also a vision where Putin continues to do this with other elections around the world, where democracy is degraded, where it at least takes us a long time to develop the resources to combat this and to sort of restore the sense of confidence in democracy that we're accustomed to having.
Well, I'm going to play the woman card. I don't think a woman public figure has been as vilified as Hillary Clinton, with the possible exception of Rachel Donaldson Jackson. That level in which the motivations, and that was constant, the barrage, and I think that we have to, something that we have to consider. And was this an anomaly, or was this a symptom of a different type of pervasive inequality?
Yeah, so I want to say that, I want to echo what the rest of the panelists say, but I'm also going to try and go in a slightly different direction. I'm a pessimist, and I think as most historians are, and say that, democracy has been eroding for a little bit of time. And in fact, I think were several pretty big red flags in the last decade or so that, should have tipped us off that something wasn't quite right. And you pointed out voter suppression, but the gutting of the Voting Rights Act. That was major.
Absolutely.
That was major. When we talk about pivotal moments, that is a
Yes.
pivotal moment. The shifting of state and local legislatures in dramatic ways, right? Away from this idea of checks and balances to just almost a complete eradication of this idea of checks and balances. The fact that the Democratic Party has not developed a bench of talent. So we now have a very old Democratic Party. We have a very young Republican Party. Also this idea of money in politics, right? And the role of money in politics. We're still trying to figure out, not just historians or social scientists in general, but just the general public, what is the role of money in politics? What role does it play? Right? Whether it be negative, whether it be positive, I think more on the negative side. And then also too, this idea that we have gatekeepers, that we have elected officials, right, who are designed to be, right, the last stand, right, the barrier between, and that our gatekeepers just roll over and take it, right? So what does that mean? It means that there are a lot of challenges going forward, right? It means, thinking about what are ways in which institutional changes happen outside of institutions that have been compromised. And I think this is something that we really have to think of. This is a place where history becomes incredibly important for thinking about organizing, right, in that deep, very deep spade work, right? I think Ella Baker calls it spade work, that goes into mobilizing, that goes into moving forward, that goes into resisting, and that goes into ensuring that, right, the centerpieces of democracy stand firm, that they stand up. Part of the way I think there's going to be a lot of conversation around this moving forward, part of the way that the body politic ensures that we are in a democracy is that they speak out, right? They engage, whether it be through traditional means and traditional institutions or through other places. And then I think at the end of the day, also remembering that a lot of this comes down to winning and power, right? And so for people who, consider themselves liberal, who consider themselves progressive, how do you win? It's not necessarily, I would argue, it's not necessarily about changing hearts and minds at this point, but incentivizing people to support what you need them to support in order to get where you need to go. So just a couple things to think about.
Well, like Leah, I'm afraid I'm a pessimist. I studied the 18th century. I spent a lot of time reading 18th century republicanism. those Republicans knew that republics decline, that they cannot sustain their virtue and they end. But I will hope that David is right and that the optimists will be right in the end, and that the democracy will prevail despite all of this for some of the reasons Leah said. And with that, I think, since we've run over our time, that we should simply thank all these four panelists for doing such a wonderful job in coming to terms with these very difficult issues. Thank you.